right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling the big one, justice. And to guide us, we've got Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Published way back in 1651, this thing's a beast.
Dense, for sure, but absolutely fundamental to political philosophy. I mean, Leviathan grapples with power, how we govern ourselves, human nature even, in a way that still resonates today.
It's wild to think Hobbes was writing this during the English Civil War. Talk about a time of upheaval. And it really shows in his work he believed humans are, well, inherently selfish, like driven by this almost primal need for power.
Yeah, it's not exactly a rosy picture of humanity, is it? Hobbes argues that without some kind of common power to keep us in check, life would be pretty grim. In his words, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Wow. So basically a free-for-all where everyone's just looking out for number one.
That's the state of nature, as he calls it. And in that state, well, there's no such thing as justice. It's all about survival of the fittest.
So no fairness, no right or wrong, just pure chaos. Makes you wonder, has anyone ever actually lived in a true state of nature?
Well, that's a debate for the anthropologists, I suppose. But Hobbes's point is more about understanding what drives us, even in a seemingly civilized society. It's the potential for that chaos, for things to fall apart, that makes us crave order. And that's where the Leviathan comes in, right?
Right, the Leviathan, this all-powerful sovereign who steps in and says, all right, everybody, calm down. Here are the rules, and I'm here to make sure you follow them.
Exactly. Hobbes believed the only way out of that chaotic state of nature is through a social contract. We give up some of our individual freedoms to this absolute authority in exchange for protection and order. Essentially, it's a trade-off. A little bit of autonomy for the stability of a system.
Makes sense. But here's what gets me. What happens when the Leviathan's idea of justice doesn't line up with our own? Like, what if we think a law is unjust, even morally wrong?
That's a key tension in Hobbes's work, for sure. He argues that even if we disagree with the sovereign's laws, we're still obligated to obey. Why? Because disobedience undermines the entire social contract and risks throwing everyone back into that state of nature. Remember, that's the ultimate fear, the thing we're all trying to avoid.
So it's a bit of a catch-22 then. We accept the potential for individual injustice to prevent total societal collapse.
You could see it that way. For Hobbes, the alternative, a world with no laws, no enforcement, was just too terrifying to contemplate. He uses some pretty striking examples in Leviathan to illustrate this. Like, he talks about the sovereign's absolute right to determine who inherits power, to decide who gets rewarded and who gets punished, even to hand out titles and honors. It's all about reinforcing the idea of unquestionable authority.
It's definitely a different world than what we're used to, especially for those of us who value democratic ideals. I mean, can true justice even exist under that kind of system?
Yeah.
Where one person or entity has all the power?
That's where things get interesting. For Hobbes, you see, justice is actually born out of the social contract itself. It's not some inherent moral truth, some universal principle, but something artificial. It's created by the laws and rules of the sovereign.
So basically, justice is whatever the Leviathan says it is. That seems like it could go sideways pretty quickly.
It's definitely a provocative idea, and it raises a lot of questions, like what's to stop the Leviathan from enacting laws that only benefit a select few? Or what happens when their personal morality, if they even have one, clashes with the needs of the state?
It's giving me a bit of an existential crisis, honestly. Like, is any system truly capable of delivering justice for all? Or are we always going to be wrestling with these compromises, these tensions between individual needs and the demands of society?
Those are some really heavy questions, and that's exactly what makes Hobbes so relevant even all these centuries later. He forces us to confront the complexities of power, the messy reality that sometimes order and security come at a cost.
And maybe that's a good place to pause for a moment, let those ideas settle in. We've covered a lot of ground already, and I think it's time for a breather.
Take a moment to consider how Hobbes' ideas, formed during a time of intense turmoil, might resonate in our world today. Are we still grappling with the same dilemmas, those same tensions between individual freedom and the need for order? We'll pick up this thread in our next segment, explore some of those deeper implications.
Welcome back, folks. I don't know about you, but diving into Hobbes's world, it's a bit intense. Like, are we really just one bad decision away from anarchy?
Well, he certainly makes you think, doesn't he? That whole idea that security, order, it all comes at a price.
We left off talking about the social contract, remember? That agreement where we swap some freedom for the Leviathan's protection. It's kind of like the cornerstone of Hobbes's whole philosophy, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels like the whole system hinges on that choice. We give up a little autonomy, a little individual power, so the Leviathan can step in and keep things running smoothly. For Hobbes, that's the key. That social contract, that's what makes justice possible. It's the bridge between that chaotic state of nature, remember, nasty, brutish, and short, and a world where we have laws, rules, and someone to actually enforce them.
So, without that agreement, that willingness to give up a bit of our own freedom, there's no justice at all. Like, it just doesn't exist.
Pretty much. Remember, in the state of nature, there's no right or wrong, just whatever individuals can grab and hold on to by force. Justice only emerges when we collectively say, okay, we're going to play by a common set of rules, and we're going to let this Leviathan figure be the referee.
I guess it's like saying, all right, we're tired of settling every dispute with our fists. Let's have someone else call the shots, someone with real power to enforce those rules.
Exactly. And that brings us right back to that question we were wrestling with before the break. What happens when the Leviathan's idea of justice doesn't match up with our own personal sense of right and wrong? What if we think a law is just plain unjust, maybe even cruel?
That's what keeps nagging at me.
Right.
Because Hobbes basically says, even if we disagree, we still got to obey. Like, even if it goes against our conscience, we have to follow the rules or risk the whole system falling apart.
He was pretty adamant about that, wasn't he? Because remember, for Hobbes, that state of nature, that anarchy, it was the ultimate nightmare. He'd seen the chaos of the English Civil War firsthand, and he was convinced that any kind of order, even one imposed by a powerful ruler, was better than the alternative.
Okay, I get it. Nobody wants to live in a world where it's a free-for-all, where there's no protection, no sense of security.
Right, so she's basically saying, look, a strong leader, even one who might seem kind of authoritarian, is better than no leader at all.
I guess that makes sense, considering what he'd lived through. But still, it feels like a pretty stark choice, trading the possibility of individual injustice for the sake of keeping society from imploding.
It is. It's a very utilitarian view of justice, focusing on what's most practical for the survival of the group. But remember, for Hobbes, the Leviathan doesn't have to be a single person, a king or dictator. It could be a group, an assembly, even a democratically elected government.
Okay, that makes it a bit easier to swallow. But even with the best intentions, isn't there always that risk of power corrupting? Like, what's to stop this Leviathan, whether it's one person or a whole bunch of them, from becoming a tyrant?
Ah, now you're hitting on the million-dollar question. It's something people have been debating for centuries. Hobbes argued that the Leviathan's own self-interest would act as a kind of check on their power.
Wait, so you're saying that the Leviathan, even this all-powerful entity, is still motivated by self-preservation?
Exactly. Because think about it. A tyrannical Leviathan, one who's constantly abusing their power, they're going to make people unhappy, right? And unhappy people tend to rebel to create instability. So in a way, it's in the Leviathan's best interest to maintain a certain level of fairness, to make sure people are content enough to stick with the social contract.
So it's a kind of pragmatic self-preservation. Like, if I push too far, if I make too many people miserable, they might just overthrow me.
You got it. Of course, there are no guarantees, right? And that's why Hobbes is so fascinating. He's not painting some utopian picture, some perfect society where everything's fair and just. He's acknowledging the messy reality of power, that sometimes we have to make compromises, accept certain levels of risk in the name of order and security.
It's kind of a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea that even in the best case scenario, even with a benevolent Leviathan, there's always that potential for things to go wrong, for injustice to seep in, for power to be abused.
And that's exactly why it's so important to keep these conversations going, to think critically about the structures that govern our lives, to question those in power, to hold them accountable. It's not enough to just blindly follow the rules and hope for the best. We have to engage, we have to challenge, we have to demand better.
You know, that brings us back to the distinction Hobbes made between justice of actions and justice of men. It's not just about following the letter of the law, right? It's about having that inner compass, that commitment to fairness, even when no one's watching.
You're getting it. Because ultimately, a truly just society needs more than just obedience. It needs people who are actively working towards a more equitable world, who are willing to speak out against injustice, who are driven by something deeper than just fear of punishment.
So it's this balancing act. We need the external structure, the laws and enforcement of the Leviathan, but we also need that internal drive, that individual commitment to fairness. It's like a two-pronged approach to building a better world.
I like that, a two-pronged approach. It's a constant work in progress, right? And speaking of things that need constant work, remember that other big theme we keep coming back to, the role of fear. Well, get this. Hobbes believed that fear doesn't just motivate us to obey the rules, it actually shapes our very understanding of what justice is.
All right, fear, justice, I'm all ears. It already feels like fear is kind of baked into the whole Leviathan setup, right? I mean, we're trading some of our freedom for protection
Right.
because we're scared of what will happen if we don't.
Right, exactly. We're afraid of that chaos, that state of nature. But Hobbes takes it even further. He says fear doesn't just make us obey the rules, it actually shapes how we define justice itself.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So we're not just talking about the fear of punishment here. We're talking about the fear that drives us to create systems in the first place.
Exactly. Remember, for Hobbes, there's no justice in the state of nature. It's every man for himself, pure survival of the fittest. So in that kind of world, what starts to feel just, what keeps you safe, keeps you alive.
It's almost like justice gets boiled down to self-preservation. Whatever prevents you from becoming the victim, from being the one who loses out.
That's it. It's a very primal, almost Darwinian view. And that fear, that instinct for self-preservation, it doesn't just vanish when we enter the social contract. It gets channeled towards the Leviathan.
Right, so now we're afraid of the Leviathan, afraid of what will happen if we break the rules, if we step out of line.
And that fear, in a way, is what holds the whole system together. It's what keeps us from reverting back to that chaotic state of nature that we're all so desperate to avoid.
I get it. But it still feels kind of unsettling, this idea that justice, something we hold up as this ideal, might actually be rooted in our most basic primal fears. It makes you wonder, can a system built on fear ever be truly just?
That's the question, isn't it? It's something that's haunted philosophers for centuries. And it's definitely worth thinking about, even today. Do we still see those echoes of Hobbesian fear in our own systems of justice?
I think you can definitely make that argument. The way we talk about crime and punishment, the focus on law enforcement and security, it all ties into that idea of maintaining order, keeping people in line. It makes you wonder, are we really seeking justice, or are we just trying to manage our fear?
Big questions, and I think that's what makes Hobbes so valuable, even today. He forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about how societies function, about the trade-offs we make in the name of security.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored this idea of a state of nature, this chaotic world without rules. We've talked about the social contract, the role of the Leviathan, and of course the ever-present shadow of fear.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? But I think the key takeaway here is that justice, it's not some simple, static concept. It's not black and white, right or wrong. It's a complex, evolving thing shaped by history, by psychology, by power dynamics.
And it's constantly being negotiated. We're always trying to find that balance between individual needs and societal demands, between our desire for freedom and our need for security. And maybe that's the most important lesson here. There's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. It's an ongoing process. Justice requires vigilance, critical thinking, a willingness to engage with those complexities. And that's what makes this whole deep dive worthwhile. It's about sparking those conversations, those moments of reflection that can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So as we wrap up our exploration of Leviathan, we encourage you to keep those questions swirling. How do Hobbes' ideas resonate in your own life, in your community, in the broader systems that shape our world? What does justice mean to you? And how do you see it playing out, for better or worse, in the world around you? Keep those thoughts alive, keep the conversation going, and keep striving for that better world where justice, in all its complexity, can truly flourish.
And never forget, that journey towards a more just world, it's never really over. It's a continuous process. So
Right.
keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing for that better future. And until next time, happy deep diving.